On the morning of July 14, 1789, a crowd of several thousand Parisians armed with muskets, pikes, axes, and whatever else they had been able to seize from the Hôtel des Invalides a few hours earlier surrounded a medieval fortress on the eastern edge of the city. The fortress held 7 prisoners, 4 forgers, 2 lunatics, and 1 murderer. It had not been strategically significant for decades. Its garrison consisted of 82 veterans too old or too injured for active service and 32 Swiss mercenaries. By 5 in the afternoon it had fallen. The Bastille's military significance on July 14, 1789, was approximately 0. Its symbolic significance was absolute. For the people of Paris, the fortress represented everything the old order had been: arbitrary power, imprisonment without trial, the king's ability to destroy any person he chose with a sealed letter and no appeal. When its gates fell, something more than a building was destroyed. A world was destroyed. And a new one that the people of France, and eventually the people of the world, are still living in, began. The country that had run out of everything. To understand why July 14th happened, you have to understand what France looked like in the years before it. The kingdom was organized around a system of privilege so rigid, and so obviously unjust, that the educated classes had spent decades cataloging its absurdities. French society was divided into 3 estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else, the third estate, which meant roughly 98% of the population. The clergy and nobility paid no taxes. The third estate paid nearly all of them, including feudal dues to lords who provided nothing in return, tithes to a church most of them had complicated relationships with, and an increasing array of royal levies designed to service a national debt that was growing faster than any plausible tax base could address. The debt was a direct consequence of wars. Louis XV and Louis XVI had between them involved France in the 7 Years' War, in which France lost most of its colonial empire, and in the American War of Independence, in which France supported the colonists against Britain at enormous expense and achieved a geopolitical victory that contributed almost nothing to the financial situation at home. By 1788, the gap between government revenues and government expenditures was roughly 20%. A structural deficit with no obvious solution that did not involve either taxing the nobility or repudiating the debt, both of which were effectively impossible under the existing political arrangements. Then the weather turned catastrophic. The summer of 1788 brought drought followed by hailstorms that destroyed harvests across France. The winter of 1788 to 1789 was the coldest in memory, the Seine froze, the mills stopped, and flour became scarce. In Paris, by the spring of 1789, the price of a 4-pound loaf of bread had risen to roughly 80% of a laborer's daily wage. People were hungry in the specific, sustained way that produces not resignation but fury. The tennis court oath, the revolution before the revolution. Louis XVI, facing bankruptcy, convened the Estates General in May 1789, the first meeting of this representative body since 1614, summoned because he needed the estates to authorize new taxes. The Third Estate's deputies arrived with grievances drawn up by their constituents across France, enormous documents cataloging the injustices of the old order, and immediately ran into the fundamental procedural problem. Under the traditional rules, each estate voted as a bloc, giving the clergy and nobility together 2 votes against the Third Estate's 1. Since the clergy and nobility had no interest in taxing themselves, the Third Estate's numerical majority was irrelevant. The standoff lasted weeks. On June 17, the deputies of the Third Estate declared themselves the National Assembly, not a representative of one estate but of the French nation as a whole. 3 days later, arriving at their meeting hall to find it locked, they reconvened in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore, in what became known as the tennis court oath, not to disperse until France had a constitution. Louis XVI, faced with a choice between using force, which might not work, and conceding, ordered the clergy and nobility to join the new body. On July 9, the National Assembly declared itself the Constituent Assembly, with a mandate to write a constitution. Simultaneously, Louis began moving troops toward Paris. Swiss and German mercenary regiments, soldiers with no loyalty to the French people and no reluctance to fire on them, appeared on the roads around the capital. The message was unambiguous to anyone paying attention, and in Paris in July 1789, everyone was paying attention. The spark, Necker's dismissal. Jacques Necker was Louis XVI finance minister and the most popular figure in the royal government. Popular because he was widely believed to be the one person in the administration who understood the financial crisis and was trying to address it honestly, and because he had published a detailed account of royal finances that revealed, for the first time, how much money the court was spending on itself. When Louis dismissed him on July 11, the news reached Paris the following morning. The dismissal was read, correctly, as the prelude to a military crackdown. Theaters closed. Stock trading stopped. In the gardens of the Palais Royal, a young lawyer named Camille Desmoulins climbed onto a café table, drew a pistol, and addressed the crowd. He told them that the dismissal of Necker was the signal for a new St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of the Patriots, that Swiss and German battalions were preparing to march on the city, that they had one choice. To arms, he shouted. He tore a green leaf from a tree and pinned it to his hat as a cockade. The crowd around him did the same. Within hours, the green was replaced by blue, white, and red, the colors that became the tricolor of the French Republic. That night, crowds broke open the customs barriers on the outskirts of Paris, the toll points where goods entering the city were taxed, and burned them. The city's prisons were broken open. By morning, an improvised municipal authority had formed and was trying to organize a citizens' militia to defend the city against the royal troops gathering outside. July 14th, the morning. On the morning of July 14th, the militia's most pressing problem was ammunition. They had weapons. A raid on the Hôtel des Invalides early that morning had yielded approximately 32,000 muskets and several cannon, but very little powder. The Bastille, it was rumored, held gunpowder. Whether this was actually true, or whether the primary motivation was the fortress's symbolic weight, the crowd's direction was clear, to the Bastille. The fortress was commanded by the Marquis Bernard-René de Launay, a career military officer in an impossible position. His garrison was small, his walls were strong, and his orders were to hold the fortress. The crowd outside numbered in the thousands and was growing. At around 10 in the morning, a delegation from the Permanent Committee, the improvised city government, arrived to negotiate. De Launay received the delegates courteously, offered them breakfast, and refused to surrender. He agreed to pull the cannons back from the walls so they were no longer pointing directly at the surrounding neighborhood, which was something. He did not agree to open the gates. The negotiations went on for hours while the crowd outside grew larger and less patient. The assault. Around 1:30, a group of men climbed onto the roof of a shop adjoining the fortress wall and chopped through the chains of the outer drawbridge with axes. The bridge fell. The crowd surged into the outer courtyard. Soldiers on the walls opened fire. People in the courtyard, who had not expected to be shot at, the outer bridge coming down must have looked like a surrender, began screaming that they had been betrayed, that the garrison had lured them in to massacre them. The fury that followed was the fury of people who believed they were being murdered. For several hours the assault stalled. The crowd had muskets but no artillery and no experience of siege warfare. The professional soldiers on the walls had both. The casualties among the attackers mounted. Then, in the early afternoon, several companies of the French Guards, the king's own household troops, whose sympathies were with the people rather than the crown, arrived with 5 cannon they had brought from the Invalides. They positioned the guns in front of the main gate and opened fire. De Launay, at this point, attempted something that would have ended the day very differently. He grabbed a lit fuse and headed for the powder magazine, which held approximately 250 barrels of gunpowder. An explosion of that size in the center of Paris would have killed thousands. His own soldiers stopped him, physically restraining him and throwing the fuse away. At 5 in the afternoon, the main drawbridge was lowered. The Bastille had fallen. The aftermath, a head on a pike. The commanders of the assault, Pierre-Augustin Hulin, a sergeant, and Jacob Elia, a lieutenant, tried to protect the garrison and escort de Launay to the Hôtel de Ville for a formal proceeding. The crowd, which had lost nearly 100 people killed in the assault, had other ideas. De Launay was seized near the place de Grève. He was stabbed multiple times, and when he was dead, a cook named Desmoulins cut off his head with a pocket knife. The head was mounted on a pike and carried through the streets of Paris. The same fate overtook Jacques de Flesselles, the provost of merchants, effectively Paris's mayor, who had been coordinating the city's response to the crisis and who was accused, with some justification, of having stalled the distribution of weapons to the militia while secretly negotiating with royal authorities. He was shot outside the Hôtel de Ville, and his head joined de Launay's on the procession through the city. The 7 prisoners were freed to enormous crowds. One of the lunatics, a man named Tavernier who had been imprisoned for decades, had to be physically supported and reportedly could not understand what was happening. The forgers were carried on shoulders and celebrated as heroes of the revolution. The Bastille's keys were sent to George Washington in America, a gesture recognizing that what had begun in Philadelphia in 1776 and what had just happened in Paris were connected events in a single larger story about what governments were for and where their authority came from. This is not a revolt. This is a revolution. At Versailles, Louis XVI had spent July 14 hunting. His diary entry for the day read, "Rain, nothing," meaning he had not killed any game. That night, the Duke of Liancourt woke him with the news from Paris. According to the account that has come down through the sources, which may be somewhat embellished but captures the truth of the moment, Louis asked, "Is this a revolt?" And Liancourt replied, "No, sire. It is a revolution." Louis's response was immediate and total capitulation. On July 15 he appeared before the National Assembly and announced the withdrawal of troops from Paris. On July 16 he recalled Necker. On July 17 he traveled to Paris, to the city whose fortress his subjects had just destroyed, and at the Hôtel de Ville accepted from the new mayor, Jean-Sylvain Bailly, a cockade in the revolutionary tricolor. By accepting the cockade, he acknowledged the legitimacy of everything that had happened. He acknowledged the assembly. He acknowledged the new Paris. He acknowledged, without quite knowing how completely, that the world he had been born to rule no longer existed in the form he had inherited it. Across France, the news from Paris ignited what historians call the Great Fear, a wave of peasant uprisings in which rural populations attacked chateaux, burned tax records, and refused feudal dues. On the night of August 4, the Constituent Assembly abolished feudalism in France, serfdom, noble privileges, the tithe, the sale of offices, in a session of a few hours that dismantled legal structures that had existed for centuries. On August 26, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen was adopted: liberty, equality, the sovereignty of the nation, the presumption of innocence, freedom of speech and religion. The stones of the Bastille were sold as souvenirs. The place where it had stood became a square. France was a different country,